thank you all for being here. We're here to discuss, I think, one of the greatest kind of ethical challenges, one of the most complicated questions that you can encounter in the world of medical ethics and the world of history. We're here to debate a question that was left to us because of a series of decisions made in 1951 and in the years after, when Henrietta Lacks, an African-American woman from Virginia, was treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And during the treatment for her tumor, cells from that tumor were sent to George Gay, a researcher, who created a cell line that has been still used today in medical research. The practice of informed consent as we know it today was not common, was not recognized in the 1950s, and Henrietta was not asked nor informed about the use of her cells. But the real question and the real dilemma is that those cells, the HeLa cells as they've become known, the product of injustice, the product of exploitation, have without question done enormous amounts of good. Henrietta Lacks, after her death, despite what was done to her, has saved millions of lives. One estimate puts that at more than 10 million lives. There are 11,000 patents for treatments and therapies that were developed using HeLa cells as one of the research tools. And everyone in this room will have benefited, either directly or indirectly, one way or another, from the injustices committed against Henrietta. So much good has come from an appalling injustice, but how do we make sense of that? How do we live with that? That's the question we're going to be debating today, and it is one of the most difficult, one of the most challenging you could imagine. And I wanted to begin with a bit more history. I want to begin with you, Mojisola. Could you explain something about Henrietta's life and how it was and the background and the circumstances of her life that led to her going to Johns Hopkins University Hospital in the 1950s?
Sure. Well, she was, as you said, she was an African-American woman who had descended from enslaved Africans. Her name, Lacks, came from her ancestral slave owner. She was raised as a tobacco farming family. And of course, tobacco in Virginia has a direct connection to this country, Virginia being named after Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and tobacco farms, plantations being created, being African people being enslaved for the purpose of white British people being able to smoke, and sugar and cotton and all those histories that hopefully many of us are familiar with. But I think it's always a good reminder that that's where she came from, and so her heritage is our heritage on these islands as well. It's all connected. So yes, so she was a tobacco farmer. Her family moved to Baltimore in Maryland, and she had 5 children, and at the age of 31, she got a very aggressive form of cancer, and she went to the only ward and the only hospital that would take African Americans, Johns Hopkins, but she very, very quickly died from this very aggressive form of cancer, and that's where her cells were taken, and yeah, the rest is history.
It's worth saying, perhaps, forgive me, I'm an historian, I always need to strike the context, that when I was thinking about her story this week in preparation for today, it's always good to remind yourselves how close people are to the past. Henrietta died in 1951, slavery in America ended in the 1860s. She was 3 generations away from slavery, and she worked as a tobacco laborer on the plantation in which her ancestors had been enslaved.
Absolutely.
And as a young girl, she lived in a log cabin, which was exactly the accommodation, that is not too grand a word, that was offered to enslaved people. So she was living in a time of segregation, a time of Jim Crow laws, a time of enormous inequality, but she was living in the shadow of slavery still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And she was born in the same log cabin in which her ancestors were. Her grandparents were enslaved, and her children were born there as well. Yeah.
So her life was shaped by these injustices. it's an injustice that leads her to Johns Hopkins, the only university that would treat her. And then something terrible but also remarkable happens. Alan, I wonder if you could tell me, when did you, as somebody involved in life sciences and medical research, when did you first hear of Henrietta Lacks and her story?
Thank you, David, and thanks for allowing me to be here. Late, I had done undergraduate and graduate work in science in the 1980s, and it wasn't until I read Rebecca Skloot's book in 2014 that I had any appreciation for the human story behind HeLa cells.
This book is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
That's right.
The best-selling book.
And I was profoundly moved by the story. In science, it's easy to think about everything you're working with as a tool, and HeLa kind of rolls off the tongue. It would be simple for any of us in the lab to not pause and think, what does that mean, or where did this come from? And that was certainly my case. So
you'd heard of HeLa and you'd used HeLa cells, yes. And we should say that the cells were called HeLa, the first letters of her first and last names. And that had just become what they were known as.
Yeah, and that would be true of scientists globally.
Yeah.
So I came to the story late, but it was powerfully moved by it.
And it was the 80s when you were studying. It's quite shocking that Henrietta didn't know that her cells were contagious. Modern ideas of informed consent just didn't operate in the 1950s. But they did operate in the 70s, and it was not until 1975 that her family discovered what had happened, discovered that cells from their mother and grandmother's body were being used in medical research. Was there a moment in the medical community when you and others were discovering what HeLa meant? A moment of recognition and reflection? Was there a moment of a moral questioning? Or was it just left down to the individual?
I don't know the answer to your question. My hunch is that there are not enough people who know the human story yet to have a moral question. And one of the objectives that I certainly had in getting a better understanding of what the story was and to think about how we could contribute as an organization was to begin to change at least that step, to make us all more aware of her contribution, who she was. And so, last week when I was meeting with one of our teams, the room was named Lacks. I said to everyone, do you know why this room's called Lacks? Let me talk a little bit about that story and its connection to science. I feel we have a role to play in educating all of us, in educating the world, and that's a necessary precursor to having the kind of moral conversation that you want science to have.
So for you personally, encountering this story, realizing the injustice at the heart of it was, in a way, life-changing.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think as we explore it, the question today is how many other doors does that open? Exploring that one story and open others.
Well, exactly on that point, what happened to Henrietta in 1950s America, post-slavery America, that is part of a longer trajectory of medical injustice, of medical experimentation among African Americans and also Black people in other parts of the Atlantic world. In your play, Family Tree, you explore Henrietta's story, but you also set it in that historical context. Could you tell me about your play and why you chose to do that?
Yeah, Henrietta's definitely the kind of the center of the story and the kind of spark for writing the play for ATC. It came very much from a conversation with myself and the director, Matthew Gier, and we both thought of Henrietta Lacks at the same time. So it was a bit of a kind of a moment of synergy and magic. But I've never been so interested in kind of one single narrative stories, and I think that's perhaps one of the risks, I suppose, of this play, and even this conversation. It becomes about a single human being. It becomes about one particular woman, Black woman, in 1951, and us as individuals. Whereas we know that we live within systems and structures. So I was thinking, okay, how do I relate this to other histories of extraction? And extraction is a kind of key theme, the key word at the center of the story, at the center of my kind of research and creative writing. So I started thinking about other women, other Black women who had been extracted from it, their bodies had been extracted from. That took me to the history of gynecology. And the the so-called father of modern gynecology, James Marion Sims, who experimented on enslaved African American women in the search to find a way to perform surgery on the fistula, on the vaginal fistula. We'll get into that. But he was looking for a particular formula for surgery, and he experimented on African American women without their consent, of course, they're enslaved, and without any kind of anesthetic or ether, although he had access to that. So the first woman that he experimented on underwent 30 surgeries, gynecological surgeries, without any form of painkiller, although he used to give them opium afterwards. So apologies to everybody and everybody listening online, because it is upsetting and it is disturbing.
We should stress that there were forms of anaesthesia available, and in the operations he carried out upon white women, he did use anaesthesia.
Yeah.
So this was a choice, and it was also influenced by another set of medical ideas that had been emerged from slavery, which is that black people felt pain less severely than white people.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that he wrote in his own autobiography. And although it's very contradictory, because some of the students who were helping him were so disturbed by the levels of pain that the women were undergoing that they couldn't cope with it anymore. And so he then used enslaved women to nurse each other and hold each other down. So anyway, and he used to be the one himself. It's a horrific story. Never read James Marion Sims' autobiography. You don't need that. But through the play, I felt it was important to find some way of imagining their voices and imagining their experience and how they survived, how they cared for each other, how they got through. What were their strategies? What did they eat? What did they drink? How did they caress each other? How did they bathe? All of those kinds of things. What were their feelings and thoughts? Because, of course, in his autobiography, he doesn't give them feelings and thoughts. He names the first 3 women he experimented on. He experimented on many, many African women. And if you go to a library in Cambridge or London or anywhere in the world, you look up the history of gynecology, you'll see Sims and he's named as the father and all of these kinds of things. But again, there's so little critique of where this knowledge comes from that has benefited everybody sitting in this room. Nobody in this room is not affected by the practice of gynecology. It's just life-changing in his life. So we've been listening to those stories, but I was also writing during COVID lockdown, and it felt really important to think about today, and I think about Britain, and an extraction from people's lives here, and particularly Black people's lives. And I was just so angered at the lack of representation at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. The lack of representation on the newspapers, etc., of Black and Asian healthcare workers, even though we were the ones disproportionately dying in the health service. So it also weaves in the stories of those NHS workers as well, to try and expand our thinking from that individual woman and think about the structures that enable that kind of life-threatening extraction.
It's probably worth saying as well that in 2020, while you were writing, while we were all in lockdown, you have your own traumatic memories of that period. This was the period when the statue of Edward Colston was toppled in Bristol. Statues fell all over the world. One of the statues that was removed was that of J. Marion Sims, that was outside Central Park in New York. Mm-hmm. So this is another story, like the story of Henrietta Lacks, which is emerging. It is bubbling to the surface, as it were. So that these stories, I think neither of the enslaved women experimented on by Sims nor Henrietta were probably common knowledge just 30, 40 years ago. Now, so there is something going on. Before I go back to Alan, I ask you, what is the role of theatre? What's the power and potential of theatre in this moment when histories are coming back into our consciousness? People are being rediscovered, their stories reassessed. What's the role of
Kudos.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that, not just because I'm a theatre maker, but because we're in this, in this tough room, dealing with this tough material, and it's a courtroom, it's heavy, and all those kind of things. And I suppose that's one of the things that theatre can do is remind us of our humanity, of getting us in dialogue, in relationship, and looking at each other, empathetic. My kind of central, the philosophy that I try to keep in my mind when I'm making theatre is the Southern African philosophy of Ubuntu, which means that I am who I am because you are who you are, or I am me through you and you are you through me, that we live in relationship and that we are not just individuals, that we are human because of our relationship to each other. And there's something that I think that theatre uniquely does is remind us of that Ubuntu, of generating a sense of Ubuntu in the way that film can, but because it's on screen and not in the live moment, it doesn't necessarily have the same impact. But that's why I'm a theatre maker. My colleagues over there are like, "Lord, yeah, we are theatre makers too." So generating a sense of Ubuntu, which has no direct translation in the English language, interestingly, but empathy, compassion, understanding, dialogue, seeing each other and being seen.
Thank you. So, Alan, you were a young researcher when you encountered the story of Henrietta, when you realised what those 4 letters HELA stand for. You now run Abcam, you're the CEO. This life-changing moment of realisation of encountering that injustice. Tell me about some of the work that you've done in the role that you're in now to try and have some sort of dialogue and some sort of intervention about this injustice.
The first is just to make sure we build an understanding of what we're talking about. So first thing I say is we have to recognize the scientific impact of her cells is immense and global. There are 5,000 to 6,000 research papers a year published in the United States. In the NIH directory, it's reasonable to assume or project that it might be 10,000 papers a year. The researchers around the world each year are producing some insight, and we'll have thought about these cells as a technical thing. They have a specification, or they have a performance, they have a means to whatever in this research that they're going forward with. And so I thought the first order of business for Abcam was to, if we were going to be involved in marketing and providing these cells for researchers for those purposes, we need to understand everything we could about the story, about how they're being used, how they're being sourced, and be not just good stewards of that story, but to think about how we would contribute to making it more human, that it wasn't just you. And that's not easy for public companies to think about. And there are a couple of things that we had to grapple with. The first is we're not a major financial beneficiary of marketing these cells. It's much less than 1% of Abcam cells that sales a year. So we're already a small company, and it's a very small part of what we do. So what does a little company like us? How do we have leverage to make a difference? And so we go out and I got in touch with Rebecca Sloot, the author of the book, and said, Rebecca, it looks like at the end of your story, you talked about a foundation. We'd like to see if we could get involved. And I'd like to think about how we can contribute some portion of our sales or our earnings from these sales back to the family. And so we started that out.
And this is Henrietta's family?
Yes, to the Henrietta's family. Or to any families that the foundation thought kind of shared that story with. That foundation itself was relatively immature. I mean, Rebecca was running it in part-time with a part-time administrator. So even getting to a point where of maturity, what would they do to work with a company like ours was something we had to work through. Then they had to face into, well, what's going to be the reaction? And does this create a liability for the company? And we thought, no, actually, we authentically are interested in this. We think this was an injustice, but we also believe and hope that she has a contribution to make through these papers, and there must be a way that we can make this work. So we kind of dove in and said, we're going to make this work. So the foundation and getting connected with that and to begin to make grants to the Henrietta Lacks family through this foundation was an really important step. what that unlocked then was followers, other people and organizations who said, oh, well, if Abcam thinks this is a good thing to do, then maybe we will as well. And so there were two other influential, well-known organizations that followed. There was Francis Collins, who was at the time head of the NIH, and the other was the Scripps Institute in California. Regretfully, it hasn't moved farther than that. I mean, my hope and my ambition is still that companies will find a way into this conversation to begin to understand why it's an opportunity. And so I sit here and hope that we're at the beginning of the storytelling experience, that we can use that in our experience in a small way to encourage others to open that door.
Can I focus in on one word you used there, which is opportunity? And it's a word that I'm really interested in when people discuss forms of restorative justice. How do we take profits from injustices in the past and try to do something positive to come out of them? It really is an opportunity to, if not make amends, at least change the balance. Tell me how you see it as an opportunity.
I think it comes back to the first point we were discussing, which is I think we need the world of science and people in healthcare to be aware of more than its HeLa cells. That there's a human story here, and I think that's our big opportunity, is to help them advance that in the way that we can start to. The other opportunity is to show everyone that it's not as scary as it can be perceived, that actually, as a public company, you can have a voice here, you can try and make change happen, and you need not be gripped by the fear of an uncapped liability. And boardrooms, when faced with the word reparation or injustice, can very easily and quickly run to, oh my God, that's not scary, my lawyer says don't engage. So my view is the opportunity would be for all of us is to educate, and then secondly, start to create a safe environment for engagement and discussion, and that might be something.
And in terms of the sort of nature of this injustice, and we've talked about the big societal injustice, but this was a young woman, she died at 31, whose husband had died, who had 5 children. The family were left with nothing, while a medical industry was slowly making profits and making advances from these cells. The family, of course, have been fundamental in bringing the story to life, working with Rebecca Swan, who wrote the book. Could you tell me something about that campaign and their involvement? Because they've not been passive in this.
Yeah, they've not been passive, and but it's when we were talking before, it's almost it is surprising that actually how incredibly difficult it's been for the family to be able to access any kind of funding or to benefit in any kind of way from the sale of these cells. And
but nobody questions the injustice. There's no debate that this happened. There's no debate that there was any form of consent. There is full agreement that these cells have been enormously beneficial to the world of medical research and the life sciences, and that they were taken from a woman without consent. So there's no sort of wiggle room about what happened. And yet the family still haven't managed or have the support to enable them to find some sort of justice for them as well as for them.
I mean, I think justice is partly knowledge, for people to know where these cells came from, and that's really important in that when the news broke that Johns Hopkins Hospital had the first immortal cell line, and her cells are dividing now. Right, where I'm sitting there and dividing.
You should probably explain that actually. So it's probably a failing of me as the chair. I wonder if I may interrupt. Alan, could you explain what is, forgive me, what is unique and, well, not unique, but very special about Henrietta cells?
Well, yes. So the first thing is that actually cells and growing human cells is inherently challenging, and keeping them alive and doing them is inherently challenging. And yet, as part of scientific research, anyone who wants to understand some aspect of human biology eventually wants to have a human cell to experiment with in controlled conditions that are repeatable and reproducible. What unusually Henrietta's HPV cells, cervical cancer cells, did was they grew uncontrollably and more easily than anything that anyone at Hopkins or anywhere else had seen before. And this distinctive feature of them has made it possible for them to still be used today. I mean, the severity of her cancer and the fact that they replicated so uncontrollably, so effectively, was the thing that's made them a powerful research tool, because frankly, they're easier to maintain and manage than other human cell lines, which have been used such a lot.
And 70 years after her death, in laboratories all over the world, her cells are still alive and still subdividing and growing.
That's correct. What is also true, though, that now there are other cell lines that are characterized, and certainly the advent of biological tools that some of you may have heard of, like gene editing or using CRISPR-Cas9 to change cell behaviors, may open up more still, and then we may see some other technological innovations as well. So the reliance on HeLa cells alone for human cell testing, I suspect you're already seeing, is less prevalent, that there are more options there.
But up until now, these cells have been involved in the research into polio vaccines.
Absolutely.
IV,
3 Nobel Prizes have been made possible through this work. The cancer that she died from, HPV, so cervical cancer, the human papillomavirus and cervical cancer that it caused, the vaccine development for HPV was through use of her cell lines. All manner of work, and it's actually hard to imagine many drugs that are marketed today not having had some story related to Henrietta Lacks' cells at some point in their discovery.
And were they involved in the development of the COVID-19 vaccines that most people?
My understanding is they were, although I don't know the direct science of all of it.
So right up to the present day, up to the greatest recent breakthrough, the RNA vaccines that most of us, I presume, in Cambridge, have had many times by now. It's huge amounts of work, careers, patents, investment wealth generated through the help of using these cells as a tool. And yet, to go back to the family we're talking about, they discovered in 1975 that this was the case, that their mother's cells were not just alive, but they were being used and had been used by them for 2 decades in medical research. And that knowledge has not enabled them, although they have had some help, to benefit, while others have.
Yeah, shareholders of companies all over the world have benefited hugely. I mean, one scientist I spoke to said to me, yeah, HeLa, she's the workhorse. She's the workhorse. And I thought, my goodness, in the 21st century, it was a slip of the tongue, and this is a really fantastic scientist. It's not about them as an individual at all. But it's the thinking that somehow that even now we're compared to horses, that we're workhorses. She's a workhorse. She wasn't a horse, but our ancestors were treated as less valuable and less human, as human as a horse. And it's really interesting what you're saying, Alan, a phrase that you repeated, which is important, is that this is a human story, and this is a human story. However, this is a story of dehumanization, and that's really important. And that's nothing to do with the family, nothing to do with Henrietta or any other activist who's worked around this. This is about scientists dehumanizing her and as her status as a Black woman. Because they changed her name in 1951, when the story broke, rather than saying her name was Henrietta Lacks, they changed her name to Helen Lane, and sometimes called her Helen Larson. And so one scientist I met quite recently who had trained around that time in the 60s was still, you remember the term Helen Lane. to make her sound less black. Yeah, not just that her family would trace it, but so that she would sound European. She would sound of European descent. So this is, and that's nothing to do with the family. That's about white scientists dehumanizing a black woman, or attempting to convey her, represent her as a dehumanized kind of figure. And that is the history of racism. That is why Cosby's statue was pulled down. That's why Sim's statue was pulled down, and that's why we still fight for equality today, an acknowledgement of our humanity. That is what racism is. It's about dehumanization. And when drugs companies and all these firms, create drugs or do experiments or whatever it is, and there is absolutely no benefit, not just to one particular family sitting in Baltimore, Maryland, but to peoples of the African continent, of the Caribbean, when there is no access to free healthcare, where health inequality is so stark in our country, this country, where you are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth if you are a black woman than if you are a white woman in Britain in the 21st century. The origins of that is about dehumanization, and that's why this is, you're right, a human story, but it's also a story of dehumanization that isn't just about cells or about drugs it's about structure and the structures in which we live, and how we all take part in trying to bring about change, and to not ignore those things, and to not be full of shame, also full of fear of liability, that we don't do anything. And so it's great that your company did something, but we can all do things in our own lives, and within the structures in which we work, to question inequality and to say, who is not represented, who's not getting a fair share, what can I do to be part of changing that?
I'd add one other thing to that powerful statement that you just made, which is that there's not enough diversity in science either. So part of the challenge here that we talk about in terms of how people express their story or even the words they choose is that there's just massive underrepresentation of diversity of all types in science. There's just not enough perspective to ask interesting questions like the ones we're exploring today, because too many people from certain backgrounds that find themselves in sciences. And I think that's another thing that all organizations, all people can think about, is how to get greater diversity in the sciences as a rich organization.
And this is one of the aims, I understand, of the Henrietta Lacks Foundation, and some of the funding that you provided is to create pathways for people from minoritized communities into STEM research and careers.
That's correct, although the task is so many that we wouldn't stop there. I think in this country in particular, there are some good organizations like Science UK and others that are trying to attract and other minorities into the sciences in a way that's really good.
And just to drill down on that, I work in television publishing and universities which have not done brilliantly on diversity and inclusion in a similar way. How lacking in diversity are the life sciences and the research?
I'll probably get the numbers wrong, but my recollection is it's somewhere between 1/5 to 1/10 what you expect based on the population and spread of the country itself.
So pretty terrible.
Yeah.
As I said, in the professions I work in, I'm not in a position to criticize or point fingers. But in some ways, that sort of leads to a sort of natural, there is a natural trajectory there. You have a historic injustice that has generated vast amounts of profit for corporations, companies all over the world. And a similar injustice has kept minoritized communities out of those professions. Is there not a sort of natural logic to trying to take some of those profits and use them to not just for justice for the family, but also to try to change the face of the medical sciences?
For sure. I mean, the desire to do that is now. It takes 20 to 30 years to grow scientists. And therefore, the actions we take now are the ones that are going to change the future for the friends and family. But both, it's virtually impossible to change it overnight.
And to push on that one step further, if I may, are the changes we're taking now enough to radically change the science as well as? No.
Probably not. And that's a good conversation to have with Paul.
I want to take questions from the audience for maybe we've got about 10 minutes. Is that right? We'll go. Questions? Please, any questions from the floor? There's a gentleman here.
It's not clear to me that the treatment of the cells, part of the renaming, would have been any different if it had been a white woman in any hospital. John Hopkins is also one of the best hospitals in the USA, probably the world. So it's not obvious that there was any mistreatment of Henrietta Lacks with disease. It just seems an odd example. There were clearly lots of injustices around affecting Henrietta Lacks. But the use of her cells, I don't think we'd be any different if it was a white woman.
Would it still be an injustice?
I'm not sure, it would not rank very high on the scale of injustice in that time. Someone was treated for a cancer, their cells were taken as part of that process. Someone then was alert enough to recognize an opportunity where those cells could benefit science. There was no injury to the person whose cells they were through the use of those cells. So the injustice is very indirect, in my view.
Mojisola?
Do you think if her name was Helen Lane, it would have been changed to Mojisola Adebayo?
I say the one thing that stood out was the change of name. That's the only difference. But in terms of the use of the cells, whether the family were considered to be beneficiaries of that use, I don't think it would have been any different if it had been a white woman. It would have to be a woman who cervical cancer.
But there's 2 points you're making. One, you've said you didn't know whether it would be any different. The other question is you deny whether it's an injustice. On that second point, to take cells and create vast profits and careers from those cells while the family languished in poverty, you, I presume, would regard that as an injustice. I would.
Yeah, because the family languished in poverty and they were not able to pay their own health bills. And they just simply didn't know. If any one of us had our cells taken, we might want our family to know and for our name not to be denied. And the history of changing names, taking bodies and body parts and making billions of pounds and dollars worth of profit is a 400-year history. So the significance of what happened to Henrietta Lacks can't be debated, and you can't ignore the detail, one detail for another, and give a kind of hypothetical scenario of if this was a white woman. It's also missing out on a huge celebration. This is a black woman whose cells are immortal, whose cells are the most powerful cells in the whole world. They're held to have in your lab because they contaminate every other cell that's around them. They're a nightmare from that point of view because they're so powerful that any other human cell that is near these cells becomes healer. So there's also something that we're missing out there, which is the uplifting of a black woman who has enabled every single person in this room to have a healthier life. That's the detail that is really missed out. And that is for one reason and one reason only, racism. That's why.
And just to push on this, sir, if you couldn't pay your rent, if you were living in a system where you couldn't get a job, you had little access to education, and people were making vast amounts of money out of your dead mother's cells, would you be entirely comfortable with that?
I wouldn't be entirely comfortable with it, but I wouldn't feel entitled to anything.
I don't think anyone's talking about entitlement. They didn't know for the first 20 years. They're asking for some sort of, they're mainly creating charities. Entitlement seems to be a phrase you've thrown into their mouths. Would you feel comfortable? Would you feel that was a just outcome if this were you and your family and you were living in a racialized system where you literally couldn't pay your way in the world?
I would think that the people who were benefiting could certainly have done more to make some acknowledgement of the people associated with the person who was.
Just to push on the actual question, would you not feel there was an injustice? Would you not feel aggrieved if you were in their circumstances?
And I feel aggrieved, but I wouldn't be placed in this injustice.
Right, okay. The lady beside you.
I just wanted to highlight the power of logistics within this discussion, and yours, David, and yours, Alan, as well. You use the word story a lot, and I think that, and education, and I think these are really powerful resources in terms of allowing us to look at these experiences from different perspectives. But definitely to my right, you use the term from your perspective, and I think part of the power of theatre is to enable us to understand lived experience from a range of different perspectives. That's what broadens our education and allows us to work towards the restorative justice that we're hoping for with this particular case.
Thank you very much. We have some questions coming in online.
Yes,
I'll come to you.
we've got a question from Professor Fulke Abimbola. Why do you think it took so long for us to become aware of Henrietta Lacks and the use of her cells?
Alan, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't know. I speculate that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. Scientists, for all of the wonderful attributes they have, what they do for society, often get down to brass tacks of what is the tool that's going to help me get to my outcome, and are in a community that often is reflective about every cell or what its origin was, or thinks it's trying to get on with advancing knowledge and understanding. And because the name had been shortened and changed, it made it even easier for that community to dehumanize and to kind of just treat this as one tool among many. So, yeah, I guess it's not surprising that in that community it was not a story, and that other storytellers outside the community have brought it to life.
But there is a decision that is made at some point to, when the power of these cells becomes apparent, to never contact the family. There's a risk that this is all passive, that these decisions are made, the power of these cells is discovered. There is a decision to not do something made, which is to not share the benefit with the family. So there's a risk that this all seems very passive.
Yeah, it's about not telling the truth.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't tell the truth about Henrietta Lacks, and they didn't tell the truth to her children, and went back to take cells from her children without telling them why. So they thought that it was something to do with cancer. But they
hoped there was further benefit from taking cells from their children.
Yeah, because they wanted more of these cells, and if we take them from the children, we can make even, make more research, we can make even more profit and all this, and lie to her children about why they were taking their cells. I think that's injustice. Also, it's also within the context of Henrietta Lacks was treated in the so-called coloured ward, and Johns Hopkins Hospital, eminent university hospital that it is, was also one of the hospitals that participated in extraction from enslaved people's bodies, which happened all over, Europe and Britain, America, where enslaved Africans were stolen, were killed, bodies were taken, but also body parts were taken from living people. And we don't know for sure, but the Ku Klux Klan and the use of white robes and everything has a direct association anyway in Black mythology. Whether it's really true, I don't know, with doctors and the so-called night doctors. That was well known.
But even within the British colonial experience, there's people like Benjamin Mosley, the Surgeon General of Jamaica, involved in medical experimentation. Enslaved Africans, developing theories that Africans felt lower levels of pain. So even putting the American examples aside, there were multiple examples of extractive forms of unethical medical experiments carried against Black people because they were powerless.
Yeah.
And sometimes in order to prove racial theories. I promise I'll come back to this later here.
It would be historical now, but I think, but the gentleman's point about if it had been cells could have been taken from a white person, I just think it would have been a different outcome. If that was a white person's cells who had that form of aggressive cancer, and this was a gut feeling that I had, that would not be kept a secret and that would be celebrated and known and possibly discussed in the family at quite an early stage, certainly more than 20 years. I just think it would be a different situation.
I mean, one of the arguments that's made is that Johns Hopkins, because it was a hospital that did make coloured wards available, that they gave themselves what sociologists call moral license, that part of the ways in which enslaved that sort of black people paid for the medical care that they weren't able to pay for financially was that they were, doctors felt it was, they had moral license to use their cells or use anything else learned from their treatment, because this was a kind of form of payment for people who couldn't pay. That idea of moral license, I wonder whether that had any impact on this decision to never contact the family while knowing the vast profits were being made.
Yeah, their family were not considered relevant, you know, and because they're not respected as people, because they're working class people. Yeah.
We've got another few minutes.
I think we could take a couple minutes.
Yeah. There's a lady here in the right-hand corner.
I work as a cancer surgeon, and as part of the consent process now, we ask every patient when they have lines of their tissue be used for research. And usually the answer is yes, because you've had a diagnosis yourself, you really are willing to do anything to try to help the greater scientific community to learn more, do more, and to offer treatments. Do you think if there had been that conversation, Henrietta would have been any different to my current patients who say yes, without question about whether it will do them any personal or financial benefit?
I mean, if I may answer that, I think very, very likely not. But it comes back to that decision. The moment there were a series of decisions made when the enormous benefits of these cells is recognised. At that moment, there is a passive decision made to not share those benefits with that family. So I think whenever I've seen this discussed, that chain of thinking, that decision, which is a passive decision, is often missed out. You decide to not share the benefits of taking those cells. Even if somebody had signed the consent form, there's still a decision to not share.
Sorry, to follow up. At that time, was there a practice to do that with anyone?
No, informed consent was not part of.
Or also go back to the family to say, oh, this is actually being quite significant. Because that would also be unusual even now, if there'd been something that was actually quite useful scientifically. There certainly wouldn't be a process to go back to that patient for some reason to tell them that even now.
But isn't that suggesting that there's something like healer cells, which of course there is? Everything about this is unusual.
It's a very good example. You know, there's been remarkable. There are still some discoveries that are made based on everyone's willingness to submit their tissue, and then progress is made in the scientific community. The lives
Alan, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I come back to your point. The decisions denied power from the people who were directly affected. We could have a debate about how many people should have been involved, but there's a denial, and when that denial is viewed in the lens of 1951 America and racism and the legacy of slavery, you might see it differently than it's just a decision that somebody had taken away from her. That's normal practice. So I think it's important to examine these things from many perspectives and to think about why it is unjust. I believe it is unjust.
And there's a difference between legal obligations and moral obligations. There's a question, would it not have been just a wonderful thing to have done, to have taken a proportion of these profits and be able to reach out to a family living in poverty whose mother, who they had lost, had inadvertently contributed so much to the lives of everyone living, almost everyone with access to medical care living in the world today. There's this sort of what you're compelled to do legally and what it would be good to do morally. And it seems that this is a case where we need to think about it to both of those prisms, not just the legal obligations. And we've got time for one more question, and there's a lady here.
It's sort of a comment going on that what you just said is I feel that if the story was told, then that does do exactly what we're talking about. It gives a platform to people of color to see themselves in science, and it then connects their story. And then there's students, they might want to go into science, they might see themselves as doctors, it's inspiring, it's putting someone in the lens. And I think earlier, the word that really struck me is opportunity. And that is so much in the narrative of so much about this. Black experience, who can benefit, and who's going to get that opportunity? And that opportunity is often denied, always denied. On one side, because of who's getting that opportunity. And it's important to have these kind of discussions and education. Thank you so much, all three of you. But also thank you for seeing that you can step into a role and not be culpable. You can be part of a dialogue, a solution, and education. Just so desperately needed.
I think that
Just one comment on that. We were talking about it takes generational change to ask questions. And it might, getting back to the question, why did it take so long? It might just have taken this long for people to awaken to the questions that they have.
Thank you very much. Any final words from you, Mojisola?
Final words, I can't see family tree. It's on. It's still on the road. It's still on tour. It's not just about Henrietta Lacks, and it's about all of us. It's on in Ipswich between the 8th and the 10th of June. That's tomorrow. And in Bristol, 13th to the 17th of June. And you can also find out about Actors Touring Company and the play, if you're interested in reading it, it's published. Read about it. It's not just about Henrietta Lacks. It's about all of us. And thank you for being part of the story.
Mojisola, Adebayo and Alan Hirzel, thank you very, very much for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and for this discussion. Thank you all for being here with us today.